Christmas was 9 days away. It was exactly 10:25 a.m. on a Saturday morning, December 16th, 1961. On this very day in 1838, the Afrikaners had defeated the Zulus at the Battle of the Blood River. Today, however, the white Afrikaner government of South Africa would witness what could only be a scene from the Night of the Living Dead. Out of nowhere, a bomb exploded at the Marshall Square police station, Johannesburg. 5 minutes later, exactly 10:30 a.m., Alexandra police station exploded. 5 minutes after that, at 10:35, the South African Broadcasting Corporation was bombed. The South African Railways followed at 10:40 a.m. and the Rand Daily Mail newspaper at 10:45 a.m. As the police, firefighters and ambulances were busy rescuing people from the scene of bombs in Johannesburg, Pretoria was also on fire. Durban, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, East London, Bloemfontein, Kimberley, Pietermaritzburg, Nelspruit, every major city in South Africa was burning. By the end of the day on December 16, 1961, 57 bombs had gone off at different strategic locations in South Africa, damaging government infrastructure, power plants, government buildings, and transportation systems, and causing many injuries. A similar mass bombing followed on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1962. And that, my friend, was the beginning of what I would like to call black violence in South Africa.
The 2023 Global Organised Crime Index released earlier this week showed that South Africa scored 7.12 on a scale of criminality out of 10.
South Africa is ranked third on the list of countries with the highest crime rate in 2023, according to the World Population Review.
Unrest.
Violent unrest.
Violent crimes.
Gun violence.
Gun violence.
Mass shooting.
Mass shooting.
Bloody weekend.
6,859 murders.
Murder.
Murdered.
Murder.
Girls are murdered.
Kidnapping for ransom.
3,300 kidnappings.
Kidnapping.
More kidnappings.
More than 100 rapes.
Personal violence is the third leading cause of death in South Africa.
During the last 3 months of 2022, around 83 people were murdered in South Africa every day. According to South Africa News 24, in the first 90 days of 2023 alone, 6,200 people were murdered in South Africa. That's about 70 people every single day. If you're someone who hates America for its gun violence that kills about 116 people each day, when you compare South Africa with a population that's 5 times less than the US, the earlier statistics scare the hell out of you. According to the South African Department of Statistics, a total of 1.1 million households experienced house-breaking incidences in 2022/2023. Rapes, murder, kidnapping, etc. are the reasons why only 31% of South Africans feel safe in their country. But you see, just as a storm surge is a product of a hurricane and a wildfire is a product of a drought, the black violence in South Africa is a product of white violence. Between 1910 and 1948 in South Africa, Afrikaners' politics were divided between the liberals, such as Jan Smuts, who argued for reconciliation with Britain, versus the extremists who expressed anti-British sentiments due to the Boer War. However, even though the Afrikaner politicians were divided about how to deal with the British, they were united in one thing. They all believed that South Africa belongs to white people. You heard that right. Afrikaners' politicians believe that South Africa is a white man's country. Hence, the white people in the country need to be protected against the black majority. On February 3, 1960, Hendrik Verwoerd, the man who created most of the controversial apartheid laws, said, "The white men that came to Africa, some to trade, others to bring the gospel, came here to stay. Especially we in this southernmost part of Africa have such claims here that we justly consider it our homeland." If you're wondering why Verwoerd justly believed the whites owned South Africa, pay attention to the remaining parts of his speech. White people are the ones who brought civilization here, who made possible the present development of black nationalism by bringing the natives education, by showing them the Western way of life, by bringing to Africa industry and development, by inspiring them with the ideals which Western civilization has developed for itself. In other words, since the white man civilized Africa, they deserve to own a part of it, and that would be South Africa. At this point, you might want to ask, if Afrikaner politicians believe that they were the owners of South Africa, what are they going to do with the blacks, who were 67.6% of the country as of 1951? Well, they decided to separate them under a policy called apartheid. But before you associate the word apartheid with negativity, read what Hendrik Verwoerd had to say about it. The policy of apartheid is not a policy of separation. It is a policy of parallel development. In a speech, he explained it this way.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness, accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them.
The most important words in this speech are, people are different and we have to acknowledge that. And if people are different, they better live separately. On June 22, 1950, the Population Registration Act of 1950 was approved. This legislation classified all South Africans into 4 racial groups: white, black, colored, and Indian. This was then used to create the Group Areas Act of 1950, which forced people to live in separate areas based on their race. This law led to the creation of townships and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of black South Africans. Then you have the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953, which segregated public facilities such as schools, hospitals, and parks based on race. This law denied black South Africans access to basic services and made it difficult for them to live their lives normally. Of all apartheid legislation up to this point, none was as evil as the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which established a separate education system for black South Africans. This system was designed to provide black South Africans with a substandard education that would prepare them for manual labor. Hendrik Verwoerd, the man who created this law when he was the Minister of Education, said, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot be used in practice?" Due to this law, black kids were forced out of white schools and blacks had only a few schools they could go. For example, as of 1948, there were 10 universities in South Africa, but only one of them was for blacks, even though blacks were 76% of the population. In 1968, in South Africa, even though black schools were few, they were the worst schools because the apartheid government spent 16 times more money on white schools than black schools. Because of the Bantu Education Act of 1953, many black kids simply couldn't go to school. Together with the Bantu Education Act, you have the Suppression of Communism Act, the Sabotage Act of 1962, the Immorality Act of 1950, the Riotous Assemblies Act of 1956, the Public Safety Act of 1953, and the Terrorism Act of 1967. Some of these laws mean anything, while others mean everything. With the above stated laws, you couldn't, as a black person, have a romantic relationship with anyone outside your race. You couldn't go to shops, beaches, or supermarkets that were for whites. You couldn't gather together in a group of 10 people. You couldn't go to a good school, live in the cities built by your ancestors, work or travel without a permit, or work certain jobs. You couldn't protest, strike, or do anything slightly synonymous with freedom.
Pass laws, which to the Africans are among the most hated bits of legislation in South Africa, render any African liable to police surveillance at any time. I doubt whether there is a single African male in South Africa who has not at some stage had a brush with the police over his past. Hundreds and thousands of Africans are thrown into jail each year under past laws. Even worse than this is the fact that past laws keep husband and wife apart and lead to the breakdown of family life. secondary effects. Children wander about the streets of the township because they have no schools to go to. Applicants want to be paid a living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing, and not work which the government declares them to be capable of. We want to be allowed to live where we obtain work, and not be endorsed out of an area because we were not born there. We want to be allowed and not to be obliged to live in rented houses which we can never call our own. We want to be part of the general population and not confined to living in our ghettos. African men want to have their wives and children to live with them where they work, and not to be forced into an unnatural existence in men's hostels. Our women want to be with their men folk and not to be left permanently widowed in the reserves. We want to be allowed out after 11 o'clock at night and not to be confined to our rooms like little children. We want to be allowed to travel in our own country.
By the 1960s in South Africa, if you were a black person, there was legislation to keep you in an open prison, take you to a real prison, or kill you altogether. The result of this is that an average black South African started seeing lawlessness as a virtue. On page 166 of his autobiography, Nelson Mandela wrote, "A freedom fighter learns the hard way that it's the oppressor who defines the nature of the struggle, and the oppressed is often left no recourse but to use methods that mirror those of the oppressor. At a certain point, one can only fight fire with fire." On Monday, April 20, 1964, from the dock of the defendant at the Rivonia trial, just before he would be sentenced to life imprisonment for attempting to overthrow the state by violent means, Nelson Mandela, in a 3-hour-long speech, said, "We felt that without violence, there would be no way open to the African people to succeed in their struggle against the principle of white supremacy. All lawful modes of expressing opposition to this principle had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or take over the government. We chose to defy the laws." From December 16, 1961, when 57 bombs went off in various cities of South Africa, until June 17, 1991, when the apartheid legislation was repealed, the most important work of any black South African was to defy the law. So, since the majority rule was established in South Africa in 1994, many South Africans have become a people who defy the law.
Clearly, the rule of law in South Africa has gone out the window.
Lawlessness atmosphere.
We live in a lawless country.
South Africa looks like a country that's gone rogue.
No one is scared of the law.
Many citizens will do what they choose to do.
Wrongdoing has been legitimized.
Crime does pay.
People should take the law into their own hands.
No mercy.
Head-on collision at criminality.
Have a lot of crime.
Violence.
Shooting.
Police brutality.
Lawlessness.
Breakdown of law and order.
Unrest continues.
Violence is a fact of life for many young people in South Africa. It is a way of survival, a way of coping, a way of expressing anger and frustration, the Institute for Security Studies wrote. Until 1994, South Africans had little reason to respect the law and no reason to believe in the rule of law. During apartheid, not only were many of the laws unjust and intended to entrench white domination, but unfair laws were also applied. In addition, the security forces, particularly the police, were used by the government to ensure that all South Africans lived in fear of the state. In this context, who could be expected to have much respect for the law or the rule of law? When you consider the fact that about 5 generations of black South Africans have lived in an environment where lawlessness was needed to survive, with the fact that the same people have less education, a higher unemployment rate, and more people living in poverty than the white South Africans, it becomes clear why South Africa ranks 3rd on the list of countries with the highest crime rates in 2023.